welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the mind of a guy who literally wrote nothing down, but somehow managed to shape like 2,000 years of Western thought. So, what was his secret? It all came down to questions. We're going to break down his entire philosophy into 9 powerful lessons you can actually use for a more, well, an examined life. Okay, so right at the center of everything Socrates believed is this huge paradox. And it wasn't just some weird historical footnote. No, this was the bedrock of a whole new way of thinking that totally changed philosophy. He built his entire legacy on one pretty startling idea, admitting he knew absolutely nothing. So, who was this guy really? I mean, to get a handle on his lessons, you've got to understand his story first. And trust me, his life was every bit as dramatic and challenging as his ideas were. So he was born in Athens, the epicenter of ancient Greece, but his life was really defined by how it ended. He gets accused of corrupting the youth and not respecting the gods, and bam, he's put on public trial. And when he's sentenced to death, he's given a chance to escape, and he says no, he refuses. And that final act, that choice to die on his own terms, became the ultimate proof of his entire philosophy. Now here's the crazy part. For a guy who had such a massive impact, it's just wild to think that Socrates never wrote a single word down, not one. Everything we know about him comes from his students, especially Plato. And that, you see, turns him from just a historical figure into, well, a legend, really. His ideas only live on because other people wrote them down. All right, so how did admitting I don't know become his central thing? Well, think of it like a master key. It's the one idea that unlocks everything else he taught. It's basically the secret to turning what you don't know into a kind of intellectual superpower. And this quote is probably his most famous one, and it's our very first lesson. So get this. The oracle at Delphi, basically the highest spiritual authority you could find, declares that Socrates is the wisest man alive. And what does he do? He doesn't throw a party. Nope. He investigates. He goes around questioning people to figure out what the oracle meant. And his conclusion was this. The only thing that made him wise was that he knew just how little he actually knew. And that right there, that's the Socratic paradox. And it's lesson number 1. True wisdom is knowing you know nothing. It's this pretty radical idea that saying I don't know isn't a weakness at all. It's the absolute essential first step to actually learning anything. See, for Socrates, being wise wasn't about having all the answers. It was about relentlessly asking the right questions. And to actually do this, he came up with a super powerful tool, the Socratic method. It's basically a timeless guide to thinking critically. Here's how it works. You take a belief, any common belief. Then you just start poking at it with questions, trying to find the weak spots and contradictions. And as you do this, you start to dismantle all the faulty assumptions and hopefully get to a much stronger, more logical truth. Okay, so how do we take these ancient ideas and actually use them in our own crazy modern lives? Because this isn't just some abstract philosophy class, right? This is meant to be a practical guide. So, we're going to group the other 8 lessons into 3 big themes that deal with our everyday challenges. For Socrates, any real, meaningful change had to start from the inside. So his next batch of lessons is all about the most important project any of us will ever have, building a strong inner character. He basically saw character as resting on 3 main pillars, and these give us our next 3 lessons. So, lesson 2, be courageous. Why? Because your principles don't mean a thing if you're not willing to stand up for them. Lesson 3, be authentic. True integrity means closing that gap between the person you pretend to be and the person you actually are. And finally, lesson 4, be humble. That arrogance of thinking you know everything, it's the biggest wall you can build against actually learning something new. And let's be real, this Socratic path is almost never the easy one. It's about choosing the discomfort of speaking up when it would be so much easier to stay silent. It's about being brave enough to admit you don't know something so you can learn, instead of just faking it. It really boils down to consistently choosing what's right over what's comfortable. All right, next up, Socrates gives us a kind of blueprint for dealing with the outside world. All its pressures, its crazy distractions, and even its borders. And this is where we find our next 3 lessons. He really tells us to question our modern obsession with just being busy. That brings us to lesson 5, beware the busyness of life. Just because your calendar is full doesn't mean your life is meaningful. Then Lesson 6 asks us to look beyond the lines on a map and to see ourselves as citizens of the world. And maybe the most radical idea of all is Lesson 7, a path to happiness that isn't about getting more stuff, but about learning to be happy with less. I mean, think about it. That idea is still completely revolutionary today. We're taught that happiness is something you get, an external prize you win with more money or a better job. But for Socrates, no way. It's an internal skill you have to practice. The ability to find real, deep joy and meaning in simplicity. And finally, his philosophy gives us a guide for what is often the trickiest part of life, our relationships and how we deal with other people. And here, he laid out 2 final, really powerful rules for how we should treat each other. Lesson 8 is to fight that natural instinct for revenge. He argued that returning wrong for wrong just makes everyone worse off. And our 9th and final lesson, have a sense of humor. He saw laughter not as something silly, but as an absolutely essential tool for being resilient and connecting with others. And Socrates definitely practiced what he preached with his classic sense of humor. He was famously married to a woman named Xanthippe, who was apparently, well, she was known for having a really difficult temper, but instead of complaining about it, he used to joke that if he could learn to deal with her, he could deal with anyone. He found the lesson and the joke right there in the middle of the struggle. So, all of these lessons, they were all put to the ultimate test at the very end of his life. Because for Socrates, philosophy was never just some academic game you play. It was about how you actually lived and ultimately how you faced death. When he faced that final test, he didn't blink. He could have easily fled Athens and lived out his days in exile. But instead, he calmly accepted his death sentence. His argument? It would be a total betrayal of his own principles to break the laws of the very city that raised him. And in doing so, he turned his own death into his last, and maybe his most powerful, lesson about integrity. And that's why his death became this kind of founding story for all of philosophy. It's a powerful reminder that living an examined life, a life where you question things, isn't always safe. It's not always comfortable. It takes real courage to challenge the status quo, especially when it could cost you everything. So in the end, Socrates doesn't just give us answers. He leaves us with a challenge. He turns his own method right back on us. So I'll ask you, what's one core belief you hold about your job, your relationships, your life, that you've just never really questioned? Because asking that question, that's the first step on the Socratic path. And that's the beginning of a truly examined life.